The Basement Door, Chapter 1, The Descent. The old Victorian house loomed before Sarah, its weathered exterior a stark contrast to the neat lawns of the neighboring homes. As a seasoned real estate agent, she had seen her share of neglected properties, but something about this one made her uneasy. The key felt unnaturally cold in her hand as she approached the front door. Inside, the house was a relic of faded grandeur. Dust swirled in the beams of light that managed to pierce the grime-covered windows. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each creak of the floorboards like a whispered warning. Still, it was her job to assess the property, and that included the basement. At the top of the basement stairs, she hesitated. The darkness below felt almost alive, tendrils of shadow seeming to curl around her ankles. She fumbled for her flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, reluctant guardians surrendering to her descent. Near the bottom, Sarah's breath hitched. The basement door stood slightly ajar, a faint, sickly light leaking from the crack. It wasn't the soft warmth of a bulb or the harsh glow of fluorescence. This light pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, casting twisting shadows on the walls. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, call the office, maybe even the police. But curiosity, that all-too-human flaw, pushed her forward. As she stepped closer, the flashlight revealed strange markings on the door and walls, deep gouges too deliberate to be the work of time or weather. And smeared across the wood were dark stains that resembled. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. The metal was slick, coated with something she didn't want to identify. The moment she touched it, a low, guttural sound rose from within, not quite animal, not quite human. The door swung inward, as if yanked by an unseen force. Sarah stood frozen at the threshold, her flashlight beam trembling in her grip. The basement stretched far beyond what the house's footprint could explain, and in the center, bathed in that pulsing, otherworldly light. Sarah's scream died in her throat, escaping as a strangled gasp as her mind struggled to comprehend the horror before her. The basement stretched impossibly far, its walls pulsing with that sickly, alien light. But it was the thing in the center that froze her blood. It was enormous, easily the size of a car, yet constantly shifting, its form never settling. One moment it seemed vaguely humanoid, the next it morphed into a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes. Its surface glistened, a grotesque blend of translucent skin and chitinous plates. And those eyes, hundreds of them, varied in size and color, blinking independently, all locked onto her. The creature emitted a low, rumbling sound that reverberated through Sarah's bones. It rattled her teeth, set her stomach churning, and made her limbs feel weak. As it slithered toward her, the floor beneath it warped and bubbled, as though reality itself recoiled from its presence. Her paralysis shattered, and Sarah stumbled backward, her heel catching the bottom step. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. The flashlight skittered across the floor, its beam darting wildly before flickering out, leaving her engulfed in the pulsing, hellish glow. In the near darkness, the creature advanced. Its movement filled the air with a nightmare symphony, the wet slap of flesh on concrete, the skittering of countless limbs, and that constant bone-deep rumble. Sarah scrambled up the stairs, her fingers slipping against the worn wood as she fought to climb. Reaching the top, she dared to glance back. The entity had reached the base of the stairs, its amorphous form sliding upwards like a sentient, oily mass. Its eyes, those terrible eyes, were fixed on her, reflecting an intelligence that was both alien and disturbingly aware. With a strangled cry, Sarah slammed the basement door shut. The heavy impact echoed through the house, dust falling from the ceiling in thin clouds. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then came a heavy thud against the door. Sarah flinched, stepping back as another blow followed, each one making the door shudder violently in its frame. The relentless pounding grew more frantic, more aggressive. And then, another sound. A high-pitched, nerve-grating screech, like nails dragging across a chalkboard as something began to claw at the wood. Chapter 3. The Aftermath. Sarah's heart pounded as she backed away from the shuddering door. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a shriek so otherworldly it seemed to pierce her very soul. She stumbled into the kitchen, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. Dialing 911, the house fell eerily silent. The pounding stopped, the scratching ceased, and even the bone-deep rumble vanished. Sarah held her breath, the phone pressed tightly to her ear as the dispatcher's voice crackled through. 911, what's your emergency? Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she explain what she had just seen? Who would believe her? Silence stretched between her and the dispatcher, the tension thickening until finally she forced out a shaky reply. I I think someone's trying to break in. Please, send help. She gave her address, her voice barely steady. The dispatcher calmly assured her that officers were en route and advised her to find somewhere safe to hide. Ending the call, Sarah glanced around the kitchen. The oppressive silence seemed to press down on her, a weight that bore into every corner of the room. Her eyes kept drifting back to the hallway and the basement door. Now it stood innocently in the distance, giving no hint of the terror she had witnessed. Unable to stand the tension, Sarah found herself creeping toward the door. She knew she should wait for the police, but something, an unsettling curiosity, pushed her forward. As she drew closer, she noticed something strange. The deep claw marks that had gouged the door minutes before were gone. The wood was smooth, untouched, as if nothing had ever tried to break through. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally so, sending a chill up her spine. Sarah hesitated, then slowly turned the knob and pulled the door open. The basement beyond was dark and still. No alien glow, no monstrous entity, just the familiar scent of damp, musty air from an old cellar. She fumbled for the light switch, and the bare bulb overhead flickered on, casting stark shadows across the concrete floor and shelves cluttered with forgotten items. Everything looked ordinary, disturbingly ordinary. Sarah descended the steps on shaky legs, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, expecting something to leap out. But there was nothing. No trace of the creature. No sign of the reality-warping horror she had just seen. The floor was dry and smooth, free of the bubbling and warping she had witnessed only moments ago. Standing in the middle of the basement, confusion and doubt began to creep in. Had she imagined it all? Was the stress of moving into a new house, of being alone, playing tricks on her mind? But it had felt so real, so visceral, so terrifying. In the distance, the sound of sirens broke through the quiet, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. The police were coming. She hurried back up the stairs, shutting the basement door behind her. But as she waited for the officers to arrive, Sarah couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. The basement may look normal now, but deep down, she knew what she had seen. And a chilling question lingered in her mind. Was it really gone, or was it simply hiding, biding its time, waiting for its next chance to emerge? Chapter 4, Doubts and Investigations. The next morning, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Dark circles underlined her eyes, a testament to a sleepless night haunted by imagined noises and lurking shadows. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind, each recollection bringing fresh waves of confusion and fear. The police had been thorough, combing through every inch of the house and its surroundings. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no mysterious claw marks, no evidence of any disturbance. The officers had been kind but skeptical, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, perhaps triggered by the stress of moving into a new home. Sarah's gaze drifted to the hallway where the basement door stood, closed and unremarkable. In the daylight, it was hard to reconcile the horrors she'd witnessed with the mundane scene before her. Had it all been a vivid hallucination? A waking nightmare fueled by exhaustion and the anxiety of living alone? She stood up, inhaling deeply. She couldn't spend the rest of her life afraid of shadows. She needed answers, and there was only one place to find them. Steeling herself, Sarah walked to the basement door and pulled it open. The stairway looked as it always had, old, wooden, slightly creaky, but utterly normal. Slowly, she descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the wall for balance. The basement was dim, lit only by weak sunlight filtering through the small, grimy windows. She found the light switch and flicked it on, the bare bulb overhead casting harsh shadows across the cluttered space. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before. Yet something felt off. A nagging feeling of being watched crept over her. Sarah's eyes darted around, scanning the room for anything out of place. That's when her gaze landed on an old trunk, half hidden behind a stack of boxes in the far corner. Approaching cautiously, Sarah noted the trunk's age. Its wood had darkened over the years, and the metal fittings were tarnished and worn. She didn't remember seeing it before, but she hadn't been focused on the basement's contents when she first moved in. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old papers, photographs, and a weathered leather-bound journal. Sarah's breath caught as she picked up the journal, its cover worn smooth with age. The pages crackled softly as she opened it. The journal belonged to a previous owner, dating back to the early 1900s. At first, the entries were ordinary, documenting the daily life of a small-town family. But as Sarah read on, the tone shifted. The writer began describing strange occurrences, scratching sounds in the walls, objects moving on their own, and, most disturbingly, sightings of a creature that eerily matched what Sarah had seen. Her blood ran cold. This couldn't be a coincidence. The journal validated her experience, but it also raised terrifying new questions. What was this entity? How long had it been lurking here? And most alarmingly, what did it want? Lost in thought, Sarah suddenly became aware of the oppressive silence around her. It felt thick, as if the air itself was heavy with something unseen. She looked up from the journal, her heart pounding as a new horror gripped her. The light bulb had gone out, plunging the basement into near total darkness, and in that darkness, she swore she saw something move. Clutching the journal to her chest, Sarah bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. She slammed the basement door shut behind her, her heart racing. As she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, a chilling realization set in. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't alone. Whatever had been in that basement had been there for a long time. And now, for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, it had chosen to reveal itself to her. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the journal again. There was much to read, and she had the sinking feeling that the answers she sought, and perhaps her survival, lay within its yellowed pages. Chapter 5. The Journal's Secrets. Sarah spent the next few days engrossed in the journal, sleep all but forgotten, as the horrifying revelations within consumed her thoughts. The more she read, the more she realized that the entity in her basement was far older and more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The journal's author, a man named Elias Blackwood, had moved into the house in 1902 with his wife and young daughter. At first, everything seemed normal. But soon, strange occurrences began to plague the family. Small things at first, like objects misplaced or odd scratching sounds in the walls, and a persistent chill in the air that defied the warmth of their hearth. As Sarah read on, her blood ran cold. Elias described how the phenomena grew worse. His daughter began speaking of a shadow man who visited her at night, whispering secrets only she could hear. His wife, Margaret, complained of nightmares so vivid that she woke up with bruises and scratches. Elias himself experienced blackouts, waking hours later with no memory of what he had done. But the entry dated October 31st, 1903, froze Sarah's heart. Elias detailed a ritual he had discovered in an old tome of occult lore, a ritual meant to banish the entity from their home once and for all. But something had gone terribly wrong. "The beast," Elias wrote, his once precise handwriting now erratic and frantic. "It's not of this world. The ritual didn't banish it, it made it stronger. Oh God, what have I done? It's taken Margaret. It's taken my little girl. I can hear it scratching, always scratching. It wants to be let out. But I won't let it. I've sealed the basement door. May God forgive me, but I've sealed my family in with that thing." Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to the final pages of the journal. Elias's writings became more disjointed, filled with incoherent ramblings, nightmarish visions, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. The last entry, dated December 24th, 1903, contained only 5 chilling words. "It's coming. I'm so sorry." Closing the journal, Sarah tried to process the horrifying truth. The entity in her basement wasn't just some random haunting. It had been deliberately summoned and trapped within the house for over a century. And now, for reasons she didn't understand, it was stirring again. A loud thump from the basement jolted her from her thoughts, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at the basement door. The scratching sound had returned, louder and more insistent. It was no longer the sound of something trapped. It was the sound of something that knew it was about to be freed. Panic seized Sarah. She couldn't stay in the house, not with that thing trying to escape. But where could she go? Who would believe her? As her thoughts raced, her eyes fell on a name that had appeared several times in Elias's journal. Professor Archibald Thorne, an expert in the occult who had advised Elias before the failed ritual. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out her phone and searched the name. To her astonishment, she found a Professor A. Thorne listed as faculty at the nearby university. It couldn't possibly be the same person. Over a century had passed, but perhaps a descendant? Someone who had inherited the knowledge of their ancestor? The scratching from the basement grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the house. Sarah knew her time was up. Grabbing the journal, her keys, and her phone, she cast one last terrified glance at the basement door before fleeing. As she drove away, she watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror, growing smaller with each passing moment. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly escaping. Whatever was in that basement had been waiting for over 100 years, and now that it had made its presence known, she feared it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. With a mix of dread and determination, Sarah set her course for the university. She didn't know if Professor Thorne could help her, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't face this nightmare alone. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, had she just left the horror behind, or was she driving straight into something even worse? Chapter 6: The Professor's Warning. The university campus loomed ahead, its Gothic spires casting long shadows in the dimming light. Sarah's hands shook as she clutched Elias Blackwood's journal, its weathered pages seeming to pulse with a dark energy. The weight of the secrets it contained felt almost unbearable. Sarah navigated her way to the Department of Occult Studies, a small, tucked-away building that seemed to shrink from the grander structures around it. The hallways were dim and musty, lined with glass cases displaying artifacts that sent shivers down her spine: shrunken heads, ancient talismans, and books bound in materials she didn't dare imagine. At the end of the corridor, she found a door with a tarnished brass nameplate. Prof. A. Thorne. She hesitated for a moment, then knocked. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a gravelly voice called out, "Enter at your own risk." The office was an overwhelming clutter of books, scrolls, and strange objects that defied description. Behind a massive oak desk sat an elderly man, wild white hair framing piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. This was Professor Archibald Thorne, not a descendant, but the very same man Elias had mentioned in his journal. "I've been expecting you," Professor Thorne said, his voice laden with centuries of wisdom and weariness. "The signs have been clear. The stars are aligning, and the barriers between worlds grow thin. You've brought trouble to my door, young lady." Sarah's throat tightened. How can you be the same Professor Thorne? That's impossible." A wry smile tugged at the corners of the old man's mouth. "In my line of work, impossible is just a word. But we don't have time for long explanations. Show me the journal." With trembling hands, Sarah placed Elias Blackwood's journal on the desk. The professor's expression darkened as he leafed through the pages, his face growing more grim with each turn. "Oh, Elias," he muttered. "What did you do? Can you help me?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "There's something in my basement. Something evil." Professor Thorne's eyes met hers, a mixture of pity and dread reflecting in them. "What Elias summoned is not a mere spirit or demon. It's an entity from beyond the veil, a being of pure chaos and malevolence. It's been trapped for over a century, growing stronger, feeding on the fear and suffering of those who lived in that house." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. But why now? Why is it trying to break free after all this time? The professor's gaze bore into her, filled with unsettling certainty. "Because it has found a suitable vessel. You. Your presence in that house has fully awakened it. It seeks to possess you, to use your body as a gateway into our world." The room swayed, and Sarah gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "What can I do? How do I stop it?" Professor Thorne rose from his chair and moved to a locked cabinet. He retrieved an ancient-looking box covered in strange, cryptic symbols. "We cannot stop it, at least not entirely. But we can bind it again, seal it away. However, the ritual will be dangerous, and it will require a sacrifice. A chill swept through Sarah. What kind of sacrifice? The professor's eyes held an unmistakable gravity, the kind that can't be undone. To bind a being of this magnitude, we need a willing soul to act as its jailer, someone to guard the entity for eternity. The weight of his words hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. You mean? Yes, he nodded, solemn and grave. If we perform this ritual, you will be bound to the entity forever. You will exist between worlds, neither alive nor dead, ensuring it remains contained. It is a fate worse than death, but it may be the only way to save countless lives. Sarah's head swam with fear and disbelief. The idea of such an existence was horrifying, but the thought of letting the entity loose in the world was even worse. She thought of her friends, her family, all the people she would leave behind, and yet the horror of what could be unleashed made the choice seem inevitable. How long do I have to decide? She asked, her voice barely audible. Professor Thorne's expression was grim. Not long. The entity grows stronger by the hour. If we don't act soon, it will break free and there will be nothing anyone can do to stop it. As if in response to his words, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lamps and plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear it, the familiar, dreadful sound of scratching growing louder, closer. Professor Thorne lit a candle, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. We're out of time, he said urgently. You must decide now. Will you make the sacrifice or doom us all? Sarah stood frozen, her entire body trembling, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. As the scratching at the door intensified, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision she made, her life would never be the same again. The Basement Door, Chapter 7, The Descent. Sarah's decision hung in the air, heavy as lead. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if unseen claws were tearing at the very walls of Professor Thorne's office. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and spoke the words that would seal her fate. I'll do it, she whispered. I'll make the sacrifice. Professor Thorne's eyes widened, a mix of admiration and sorrow crossing his weathered features. You're braver than you know, child. Now we must hurry. The entity grows stronger with each passing moment. With surprising agility for a man his age, Thorne began gathering items from around his cluttered office. Candles, a silver dagger etched with strange inscriptions, and a leather-bound tome that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as he stuffed everything into an old satchel. We must return to your house, he explained, his voice tight with urgency. The ritual must be performed where the entity is strongest, at the threshold it's trying to cross. The drive back to Sarah's house felt like a blur. The streets seemed unnaturally empty, the few people they passed appearing as little more than shadows. As they neared her neighborhood, Sarah noticed a thick, unnatural fog rolling in, obscuring the houses and street signs. It knows, Professor Thorne muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. It's trying to stop us. They pulled up to Sarah's house, the structure looming before them like a malevolent sentinel. The windows were dark, but Sarah could have sworn she saw movement behind the curtains. The fog swirled around their ankles as they hurried to the front door. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive. Sarah's ears popped as if she'd descended deep underwater. The scratching sound was everywhere now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath their feet. It was maddening. To the basement, Thorne commanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Quickly now. They made their way to the basement door. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the knob. It was ice cold to the touch, and for a moment she thought she felt it pulse like a beating heart. As the door swung open, a blast of frigid air hit them. The wooden stairs creaked ominously as they descended, each step feeling like it might give way at any moment. The faint light that had once spilled from the partially open door at the bottom was gone, replaced by an inky, impenetrable darkness. Stay close, Thorne warned, fumbling in his satchel for a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the horrors that awaited them. The walls were coated in a viscous black substance that seemed to move and writhe on its own. Claw marks, deeper and more vicious than before, marred every surface. And there, at the far end of the basement, stood the door, no longer ajar but wide open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness beyond. "Oh God," Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible over the now deafening scratching sound. Professor Thorne's face was grim as he began setting up for the ritual. He drew a complex series of symbols on the floor with chalk, placed candles at specific points, and opened the leather-bound tome to a marked page. "Remember," he said, turning to Sarah, "once we begin, there's no turning back. The entity will fight us with everything it has. It will try to tempt you, to break your resolve. You must stay strong no matter what you see or hear. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, though her body trembled with fear. She watched as Thorne began to chant in a language she didn't recognize, his voice rising above the cacophony of scratches and whispers filling the basement. As the ritual progressed, the air around them thickened. Sarah found it harder to breathe, and her vision began to blur at the edges. The darkness beyond the open door pulsed and writhed, and she could have sworn she saw faces forming in the void, twisted, agonized faces that seemed to beg for release. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice she recognized. "Sarah? Honey, is that you?" Her blood ran cold. It was her mother's voice coming from the swirling vortex. "Mom," she whispered, taking an involuntary step forward. "Don't listen," Thorne shouted, his voice strained. "It's not real. It's trying to trick you." But as Sarah stared into the darkness, she saw a figure forming, the unmistakable silhouette of her mother reaching out with pleading arms. "Please, Sarah," the figure begged. "Help me, I'm lost. I'm so cold and alone. Please, come to me." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Every fiber of her being wanted to run to the figure to embrace her mother. But Thorne's words echoed in her mind. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. As she hesitated, the figure of her mother began to change. The loving face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred and malice, the arms reaching out for her, elongated fingers transforming into razor-sharp claws. "You will join us!" The thing that was not her mother shrieked, its voice a hellish cacophony of 1,000 tormented souls. Sarah screamed as the creature lunged forward, its claws inches from her face. But at that moment, Professor Thorne stepped between them, brandishing the silver dagger. "Now, Sarah!" he yelled over the inhuman howling that filled the basement. "The final step! You must choose, now!" As the professor held the entity at bay, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her life. The path before her was clear, but the cost was unimaginable. With trembling hands, she reached for the dagger, knowing that what she did next would change everything forever. Chapter 8: The Sacrifice. Sarah's fingers closed around the hilt of the silver dagger, its weight both unfamiliar and unsettling in her hand. The basement had transformed into a maelstrom of otherworldly energies, the air thick with the stench of decay and the echoing cries of countless tormented souls. Professor Thorne's chanting reached a fever pitch, his words seemingly pushing back the darkness that threatened to engulf them. The entity, still bearing a twisted resemblance to Sarah's mother, thrashed against an invisible barrier, its claws leaving marks in the air. "Now, Sarah!" Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. "The sacrifice must be made. It's the only way to close the portal." Sarah's mind raced. What sacrifice? Surely he didn't mean... No, there had to be another way. She looked frantically around the basement, searching for any alternative. But as her eyes met Thorne's, she saw the grim resolution there. She understood then, with a sickening clarity, what needed to be done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Then, with a swift, decisive motion, she plunged the dagger into her side. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah gasped, her legs giving way beneath her. As she collapsed to the floor, warmth pooled around her, seeping into the intricate chalk symbols Thorne had drawn. The effect was instantaneous. The symbols began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. The entity let out a horrifying shriek, its form beginning to distort and unravel. "Yes!" Thorne cried out, a mix of triumph and anguish in his voice. "It's working! Hold on, Sarah, hold on!" But Sarah could feel her life force ebbing away with each heartbeat. The basement around her began to blur and fade. She could hear Thorne's voice, but it seemed to come from very far away. As her vision dimmed, Sarah saw the swirling vortex of the portal begin to contract. The entity, now nothing more than a writhing mass of darkness, was being pulled back into the abyss. Its inhuman screams filled the air, a cacophony of rage and defeat. With her last ounce of strength, Sarah turned her head to look at the basement door. The claw marks were fading, the smears of dirt disappearing as if they had never been there. The faint light that had once spilled from beneath it was gone, replaced by the comforting darkness of a normal, mundane basement. As consciousness slipped away, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She had done it. She had saved them all. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was Professor Thorne's voice, choked with emotion. "Oh, my brave girl. What have I done?" Then, silence. Sarah floated in a void, formless and timeless. She had no sense of how long she drifted there. It could have been seconds or centuries. But slowly, gradually, she became aware of a rhythmic beeping sound, growing louder and more insistent. With great effort, she forced her eyes open. The harsh fluorescent lights above made her wince. As her vision cleared, she realized she was in a hospital room. The beeping was coming from a heart monitor beside her bed. "Sarah? Oh, thank God." She turned her head to see her father, his face haggard and tear-stained, sitting by her bedside. He grasped her hand, his touch warm and comforting. "Dad?" Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. What happened?" Her father's face clouded with confusion and worry. "We were hoping you could tell us, sweetheart. You've been in a coma for 3 weeks. The doctors, they couldn't explain it. You were found in the basement, unconscious. There was so much blood." Sarah's mind reeled. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? But it had felt so real. As if reading her thoughts, her father continued, "The police have been investigating. They found some strange things in the basement. Symbols drawn on the floor, candles, old books, and Professor Thorne." He trailed off, his expression darkening. "What about Professor Thorne?" Sarah asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Her father hesitated before answering. "He's missing, Sarah. No one's seen him since the night you were found. The police think he might have had something to do with what happened to you." Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by a flood of memories and emotions. She knew the truth, but how could she possibly explain it? Who would believe her? As she lay there trying to make sense of it all, a nurse entered the room. "Oh, you're awake!" she exclaimed, her cheerful voice always at odds with the somber atmosphere. "That's wonderful news. How are you feeling, dear?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, her eyes fell on something that made her blood run cold. There, on the nurse's forearm, barely visible beneath the sleeve of her uniform, was a series of thin, parallel scars, marks that resembled claw wounds. The nurse noticed Sarah's gaze and quickly pulled her sleeve down, a flicker of something passing across her face. For a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw the nurse's eyes turn completely dark. But then the moment passed, and the nurse was all smiles again. "The doctor will be in shortly to check on you," she said, her voice unnaturally cheerful. "You just rest now, dear. After all, you've been through quite an ordeal." As the nurse left the room, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at her father, who seemed oblivious to the strange interaction. Slowly, carefully, she reached down and felt her abdomen where she remembered plunging the dagger. There was no wound, no scar, nothing to suggest she had ever been injured. But as her fingers brushed against her skin, she felt something else, something that hadn't been there before. A series of raised bumps, forming a pattern she couldn't quite make out. With growing horror, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. In fact, it might have only just begun. Chapter 9: Echoes of the Abyss. The days following Sarah's awakening were a blur of medical tests, police interviews, and hushed conversations just beyond her hearing. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, prodded and examined by doctors who couldn't explain her miraculous recovery, and detectives who couldn't or wouldn't believe her fragmented memories of what had transpired in the basement. But worse than the constant scrutiny was the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The raised bumps on her abdomen seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking, forming patterns that made her head swim if she stared at them too long. And then there were the dreams. Every night, Sarah found herself back in that basement, reliving the horror of her encounter with the entity. But in these dreams, the outcome was different. Sometimes she was the one pulled into the abyss. Other times, she watched helplessly as the creature wearing her mother's face devoured everyone she loved. And always, always, there was Professor Thorne, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and something darker, more sinister. "You didn't finish it, Sarah," he would say, his voice echoing as if from a great distance. "The door is still open. You have to close it." She would wake from these nightmares drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, the taste of copper in her mouth. More than once, she'd found herself standing at the top of the basement stairs with no memory of how she'd gotten there. On the fifth night after her awakening, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She waited until the house was quiet, her father's soft snores drifting from his bedroom, before she crept down to the kitchen. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold linoleum as she retrieved a flashlight from the drawer. The basement door loomed before her, a dark maw in the shadows of the hallway. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The metal was ice cold against her palm, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt it pulse, like a living thing. Taking a deep breath, Sarah turned the knob and pulled the door open. The hinges creaked ominously, the sound seeming to echo through the silent house. She paused, listening intently, but her father's snores continued uninterrupted. The beam of her flashlight illuminated the wooden stairs leading down into darkness. They looked ordinary enough, just old, worn steps covered in a thin layer of dust. But as Sarah's gaze traveled down to the landing, her breath caught in her throat. The door at the bottom of the stairs was slightly ajar, just as it had been that fateful night. And there, spilling out from beneath it, was a faint, sickly green light. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she took the first step down. The wood groaned beneath her weight, and she froze, certain that the noise would wake her father. But the house remained silent, save for the faint whisper that seemed to be coming from behind that door. Step by agonizing step, Sarah made her way down the stairs. As she drew closer to the bottom, she could make out words in that whisper. Her name, repeated over and over in a voice that was at once familiar and utterly alien. When she reached the landing, Sarah paused, her hand hovering inches from the door. The claw marks were still there, deep gouges in the wood that seemed to pulse with that same sickly light. And the smears of dirt, as she watched, they seemed to writhe and shift, forming shapes that made her eyes water and her mind recoil. "Sarah?" The voice was clearer now, coming from just behind the door. It sounded like her mother, but there was something else too, something ancient and hungry. "Sarah, sweetheart, come to Mommy." Almost against her will, Sarah's hand moved toward the door. Her fingertips had just brushed the rough wood when a hand clamped down on her shoulder, yanking her backward. Sarah screamed, spinning around to face her attacker. The beam of her flashlight illuminated a face she never thought she'd see again. "Professor Thorne?" she gasped. The professor looked terrible. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face gaunt and lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with an intense, almost maniacal light. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's stronger now, feeding off your connection to it. We have to seal the door, Sarah, permanently this time." "But how?" Sarah asked, her mind reeling. I thought it was over." Thorne's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Oh, my dear girl, it's never over. Not really. The best we can hope for is to keep the darkness at bay, one day at a time." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound book. The cover was unmarked, but Sarah could feel the power emanating from it, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "This contains the true sealing ritual," Thorne explained. "But it comes at a cost. Are you willing to pay it, Sarah? Are you willing to sacrifice everything to keep that door closed?" Before Sarah could answer, a horrific shriek erupted from behind the basement door. The wood bulged outward as if something massive was pressing against it from the other side. "Decide quickly," Thorne urged, his eyes wild. "It's now or never." Sarah looked from Thorne to the straining door and back again. The patterns on her abdomen burned, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Whatever it takes." Thorne nodded grimly and opened the book. As he began to chant in a language Sarah didn't recognize, the basement filled with an otherworldly light. The door at the bottom of the stairs shuddered and creaked, the wood splintering as whatever lay behind it fought to break free. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing herself for what was to come. As Thorne's chanting reached a fever pitch, she felt a tugging sensation in her chest, as if her very soul was being pulled from her body. The last thing she heard before consciousness fled was the sound of the basement door slamming shut with a finality that shook the very foundations of the house. And then, silence. Chapter 10, The Price of Sealing. Sarah awoke to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of disinfectant. For a moment, she thought she was back in the hospital, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized she was lying on a cot in what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. Shelves lined with ancient-looking books and jars filled with unidentifiable substances surrounded her. She tried to sit up, but her body felt leaden and unresponsive. A wave of panic washed over her as she remembered the events in the basement, the ritual, Professor Thorne, the feeling of her soul being torn apart. "Easy now," a familiar voice said. Professor Thorne's face swam into view, looking haggard but relieved. "The sealing took a lot out of you. It'll take some time for your body and spirit to realign." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. Thorne held a glass of water to her lips, and she drank greedily. "What happened?" she finally managed to croak out. Thorne's expression grew somber. "We sealed the door, Sarah, for good this time, but as I warned you, it came at a cost." He helped her sit up slowly, and for the first time, Sarah noticed something was different. The room seemed muted somehow, as if she was viewing it through a thin veil, and there was a hollowness inside her, an emptiness where something vital used to be. "I don't understand," she whispered, a creeping dread settling over her. Thorne sighed heavily, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The entity, the thing behind the door, it had formed a connection with you, Sarah, a parasitic bond. To seal the door permanently, we had to sever that connection." He paused, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "But connections like that, they're not just physical, they're spiritual. To cut it off, we had to sacrifice a part of your soul." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt her breath catch in her throat as the full implications sank in. "A part of my soul?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Thorne nodded gravely. "It was the only way to ensure the door remained closed. Your sacrifice, it's powering the seal, keeping the darkness at bay." Sarah's mind reeled. She tried to process what this meant, what she had given up. "Will I ever be whole again?" The professor's silence was answer enough. Sarah felt a sob building in her chest, but it seemed distant, muffled. Even her grief felt incomplete. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. "If there had been any other way—" She shook her head, cutting him off. "No, I made the choice. I just didn't realize." Her voice trailed off as she caught sight of her reflection in a nearby mirror. She looked the same, and yet there was something missing in her eyes. A spark, a vitality that had always been there before. "What happens now?" she asked, tearing her gaze away from the haunting image. Thorne's expression hardened. "Now, we make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain. The door is sealed, but there are other doors, other weak points where the darkness can seep through. And now that you've glimpsed the truth of what lies beyond, you have a responsibility." He stood, walking over to a bookshelf and pulling down a heavy tome. "You're part of this fight now, Sarah, whether you want to be or not. The question is, are you ready to learn what that truly means?" Sarah looked down at her hands, remembering the terror of the basement, the whispers in the dark. She thought of her mother, of the thing that had worn her face. And she thought of the emptiness inside her, the piece of herself that was now forever lost. She met Thorne's gaze, her jaw set with determination. "I'm ready," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Teach me everything." Thorne nodded, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's begin. The world is full of doors, Sarah, and not all of them lead to places we're meant to go. It's time you learned how to recognize them and how to keep them shut." As Thorne began to speak, laying out the hidden truths of the world, Sarah listened intently. The hollow ache inside her remained, a constant reminder of what she had lost. But with each revelation, each dark secret unveiled, she felt a new purpose growing within her. The basement door was sealed, but her journey into the shadows was just beginning. And somewhere in the depths of her fractured soul, Sarah vowed that no matter the cost, she would never let another innocent fall prey to the horrors that lurked behind closed doors. The war against the darkness had gained a new soldier, forged in the crucible of terror and sacrifice. And as the first light of dawn began to seep through the laboratory windows, Sarah steeled herself for the battles to come, knowing that the true test of her resolve lay in the long nights ahead. Chapter 11: The Echoes of Sacrifice. Weeks had passed since the sealing of the basement door, but for Sarah, time seemed to move differently now. The world around her felt muted, as if she were experiencing it through a veil of gauze. Colors were less vibrant, sounds less crisp, and even her own emotions seemed to lack the intensity they once had. She sat in Professor Thorne's study, surrounded by ancient tomes and arcane artifacts. The room had become a second home to her over the past month, as she dove headfirst into her new role as a guardian against the darkness. "Focus, Sarah," Thorne's voice cut through her reverie. "You need to concentrate on the sigil. Feel its power. Let it resonate with what's left of your essence." Sarah stared at the complex symbol etched onto the parchment before her. She tried to will her fragmented soul to connect with the mystical energies contained within the intricate lines and curves. A faint buzzing filled her ears, and for a moment she thought she felt something. But then it slipped away, like water through cupped hands. She slumped back in her chair, frustration etched across her face. "It's not working, Professor. I can't feel it like I used to." Thorne's expression softened, a mixture of sympathy and concern in his eyes. "The loss of a part of your soul has affected you more profoundly than we anticipated. But you mustn't give up, Sarah. Your sacrifice has given us a fighting chance against the darkness. We need you now more than ever." Sarah nodded, but the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The hollowness inside her was a constant reminder of what she had given up. She thought of her life before, her studies, her friends, her dreams. It all seemed so distant now, like a half-remembered dream. "Tell me again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what's out there, what we're fighting against." Thorne leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a faraway look. "There are things in this world, Sarah, older than humanity itself. Ancient, malevolent entities that exist in the spaces between realities. They hunger for our world, for the life and energy that flows through it. The basement door was just one of many weak points, places where the veil between worlds grows thin." He paused, his gaze sharpening as he looked at her. "But there are other doors, other cracks in reality. And now that you've been touched by the other side, you have the potential to sense them, to help us find and seal them before it's too late." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the enormity of what Thorne was saying. She remembered the terror of the basement, the feeling of something vast and unknowable pressing against the edges of her consciousness. The thought of facing that again made her shudder. "But how can I help?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet Thorne's gaze. "I feel broken, incomplete." Thorne leaned forward, his voice intense. "That very brokenness is what makes you valuable, Sarah. The part of you that was sacrificed created a connection, a bridge between our world and theirs. With proper training, you can learn to use that connection, to sense the presence of other weak points before they fully manifest." He stood up, walking over to a map pinned to the wall. Red pins dotted its surface, each marking a location of suspected paranormal activity. "We've already identified several potential hotspots. I believe you're ready for your first field assignment." Sarah felt a mix of fear and excitement course through her. Despite the numbness that had become her constant companion, the prospect of taking action, of making a difference, sparked something within her. "Where are we going?" she asked, standing up to join Thorne at the map. He pointed to a pin stuck in a small town several hours away. "There have been reports of strange occurrences in an old church there, sightings of impossible things, people going missing, the usual harbingers of a potential breach." Sarah studied the map, trying to imagine what horrors might be unfolding in that quiet little town. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Thorne replied, a grim smile on his face. "Pack light, but be prepared for anything. The darkness takes many forms, and we must be ready to face whatever comes through." As Sarah left the study to prepare for the journey ahead, she felt a strange mix of emotions. The fear was still there, a constant companion since her encounter in the basement. But alongside it was a growing sense of purpose, a determination to ensure that her sacrifice had meaning. She may have lost a part of herself sealing that first door, but in doing so, she had gained something as well: a role in a hidden war, a chance to protect others from the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. As she packed her bag, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The haunted look in her eyes remained, but there was something else there now, too: a steely resolve, a flicker of the strength she would need for the battles to come. The basement door was sealed, but countless others remained, and Sarah, fractured soul and all, would face them head on, armed with newfound knowledge and the echoes of her sacrifice. Tomorrow she would step into a new chapter of her life, venturing into the unknown to confront the darkness that threatened to consume everything she held dear. The road ahead would be perilous, but Sarah was ready to walk it, no matter the cost. Chapter 12, Echoes in the Nave. The old church loomed before Sarah and Professor Thorne, its weathered stone facade a silent sentinel against the encroaching twilight. Gothic spires reached toward the darkening sky, their edges softened by years of neglect and the creeping tendrils of ivy that clung to the ancient walls. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as they approached the heavy wooden doors. The hollowness inside her, that constant reminder of her sacrifice, seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar energy. She glanced at Thorne, who nodded grimly. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, struggling to find words to describe the sensation. "It's like a vibration, a hum that's just below the threshold of hearing, but I feel it in my bones, in the empty spaces inside me." Thorne's expression was a mixture of concern and fascination. "That's your connection to the other side, Sarah. It's responding to whatever is happening here. We must proceed with caution." With a shared look of determination, they pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the church. The interior was a study in shadows and decay. Dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through stained glass windows, their once vibrant colors now muted and somber. As they moved deeper into the nave, Sarah's senses were on high alert. The strange vibration grew stronger, and she could swear she heard whispers echoing from the darkened corners of the building. Fragments of long-forgotten prayers and desperate pleas seemed to hang in the air, a ghostly chorus that sent shivers down her spine. "Professor?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with tension. "What exactly are we looking for?" Thorne's eyes scanned the shadows, his hand resting on the worn leather satchel that contained their protective wards and arcane tools. Anything out of the ordinary, signs of ritualistic activity, areas where the air feels different. "Trust your instincts, Sarah. Your connection to the other side makes you our best detection tool." As if in response to his words, Sarah felt a sudden pull toward the altar at the far end of the church. The sensation was so strong it nearly took her breath away. There, she gasped, pointing toward the raised platform. "Something's not right there." They approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath their feet. As they drew closer, Sarah could see that the altar cloth was askew, revealing strange markings carved into the wood beneath. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift as she looked at them, making her head spin. "Careful," Thorne warned, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Don't look directly at them. Those are binding sigils, ancient and powerful. Someone's been trying to open a doorway here." Sarah tore her gaze away from the unsettling symbols, fighting down a wave of nausea. "But why here? Why a church?" Thorne's expression was grim as he began to set up a protective circle around them. "Places of faith have power, Sarah. They're nexus points of human belief and emotion. In the right hands, that power can be a force for good, but in the wrong hands..." He didn't need to finish the thought. Sarah could feel the wrongness in the air, a palpable sense of violation. Whatever had been done here was an affront to the very purpose of this sacred space. As Thorne worked to counteract the binding sigils, Sarah kept watch, her fractured soul on high alert for any sign of danger. The whispers in the shadows seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Shapes flickered at the edge of her vision, there and gone before she could focus on them. Suddenly, a bone-chilling scream echoed through the church, causing both Sarah and Thorne to jump. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a cry of anguish that reverberated through Sarah's very being. "Professor!" she cried out, her heart racing. "What was that?" Thorne's face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he completed the protective circle. "I fear we may be too late," he said grimly. "The veil between worlds is already thinning. We need to seal this breach, and quickly." As if in response to his words, the air around the altar began to shimmer and distort. The carved symbols pulsed with an unholy light, and Sarah could feel the hollowness inside her resonating with whatever was trying to push through. "Sarah," Thorne's voice cut through her rising panic, "I need you to focus. Remember your training. Use your connection to the other side. Help me push it back." Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah closed her eyes and reached out with her fractured soul. She could feel the wrongness, the tear in reality that was widening with each passing moment. Gritting her teeth, she pushed back against it, willing the breach to close. The air crackled with energy as Sarah and Thorne fought against the encroaching darkness. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and Sarah could feel something vast and ancient pressing against her mind, seeking entry. In that moment, suspended between two realities, Sarah understood the true nature of her sacrifice. The part of her soul she had given up wasn't lost. It was a bridge, a connection that allowed her to stand at the threshold and say, "No further." With a final surge of will, Sarah pushed back against the invading presence. There was a sound like reality itself tearing, a flash of blinding light, and then silence. Sarah opened her eyes to find herself on her knees, gasping for breath. The altar before her was nothing more than splintered wood, the binding sigils reduced to ash. Thorne knelt beside her, his face etched with equal parts exhaustion and wonder. "You did it," he breathed, helping her to her feet. "You sealed the breach." As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah felt the weight of what had just transpired settle over her. She had faced the darkness and pushed it back, but at what cost? The hollowness inside her felt deeper now, a yawning chasm that whispered of the battles yet to come. "What now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Thorne's gaze was sympathetic but resolute. "Now we rest and recover. But tomorrow we continue our work. This was just one breach, Sarah. There are others out there waiting to be found and sealed." As they made their way out of the now quiet church, Sarah knew that her life had irrevocably changed. The basement door may have been the beginning, but it was far from the end. A war was brewing in the shadows, and she was now on the front lines. With each step, Sarah steeled herself for the challenges ahead. The path before her was dark and fraught with danger, but she would walk it nonetheless. For in the face of encroaching darkness, she had become a beacon of light, fractured, perhaps, but unbroken. Chapter 13, Echoes of the Abyss. Sarah jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. The remnants of her nightmare clung to her consciousness, refusing to dissipate even as reality reasserted itself. She found herself tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, the dim light of early dawn barely penetrating the heavy curtains of her bedroom. As her breathing steadied, Sarah became acutely aware of the hollowness within her. It seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, a constant reminder of her connection to the realm beyond. The events at the church had left an indelible mark on her psyche, and even in sleep, she found no respite from the horrors she had witnessed. Closing her eyes, Sarah tried to piece together the fragments of her nightmare. Images flashed behind her eyelids, the writhing symbols on the altar, the shimmering tear in reality, and something else. Something that lurked just beyond her comprehension, vast, ancient, and hungry. With a shuddering breath, Sarah forced herself out of bed. The cool air of her apartment raised goosebumps on her skin as she made her way to the bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the lingering tendrils of dread that clung to her. As she looked up into the mirror, Sarah froze. For a brief moment, she could have sworn she saw something move in the reflection behind her. A dark, formless shape that seemed to writhe and pulse with malevolent intent. She whirled around, heart racing, but found only the empty bathroom behind her. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered to herself, gripping the edges of the sink until her knuckles turned white. It was just a dream. Just a dream. But even as she tried to reassure herself, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. The line between reality and nightmare had become blurred, and the horrors she faced in her sleep were echoes of very real dangers that lurked in the waking world. A sudden knock at her apartment door made Sarah jump. She glanced at the clock. It was barely 6 a.m. Who could be calling at this hour? Cautiously, she approached the door, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The hollow feeling inside her seemed to intensify, as if responding to some unseen presence. Sarah's hand hovered over the doorknob, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to hide, to run. Another knock, more insistent this time. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door. Professor Thorne stood in the hallway, his face ashen and his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to go. Now." "What's happened?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her coat. She knew that look in Thorne's eyes. Something was very wrong. Thorne glanced nervously over his shoulder before replying. "Another breach, bigger than anything we've seen before. And Sarah, I think it's connected to your basement, to where this all began." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Images from her nightmare flashed through her mind. The writhing symbols, the shimmering tear, the ancient hunger that lurked beyond. She realized with a sinking feeling that it hadn't been just a dream. It had been a warning. "Give me 2 minutes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As Thorne nodded and stepped back, Sarah rushed to get dressed. Her hands shook as she laced up her boots, her mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. As she rejoined Thorne in the hallway, Sarah felt a strange sense of destiny settling over her. The hollowness inside her thrummed with an otherworldly energy, as if recognizing the gravity of what was to come. "Are you ready?" Thorne asked, his hand on her shoulder. Sarah nodded, steeling herself for whatever horrors awaited them. "Let's go," she said, her voice low and determined. "It's time to face what's behind that basement door once and for all." As they hurried out into the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing toward a confrontation that would change everything. The echoes of the abyss were growing louder, and soon she knew they would have to answer its call. Chapter 14: The Convergence. The pre-dawn streets were eerily quiet as Professor Thorne's car sped through the city. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers digging into the armrest, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The hollow feeling inside her pulsed with an otherworldly energy, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Tell me everything," Sarah demanded, breaking the tense silence. "What exactly did you see?" Thorne's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "It started about an hour ago. Our monitoring equipment picked up a massive spike in interdimensional energy. At first, we thought it was a malfunction, but then—" He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Then what?" "Then we got visual confirmation," Thorne continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A tear, Sarah. A tear in the fabric of reality itself, and it's growing." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Images from her nightmare flashed through her mind, the writhing symbols, the shimmering portal. "Where?" she managed to ask. "That's the thing," Thorne replied, glancing at her with a mix of fear and fascination. "It's centered on your old house, on that basement." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Of course, it all led back to where it began. The basement door that had haunted her dreams for so long was now the focal point of something far more terrifying than she could have imagined. As they approached the outskirts of town, Sarah could see an otherworldly glow on the horizon. It pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, casting long, twisted shadows across the landscape. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. "My God," Thorne breathed as they turned onto the street where Sarah's old house stood. Or rather, where it had stood. The house was gone, consumed by a swirling vortex of energy that reached high into the sky. At its center, Sarah could make out the faint outline of a door, the basement door, suspended in mid-air, surrounded by wreathing tendrils of darkness. As they stumbled out of the car, Sarah felt the air crackle with energy. The hollow feeling inside her resonated with the swirling chaos before them, and for a moment she felt as if she might be torn apart by the conflicting forces. "Sarah!" Thorne's voice cut through the din. "We need to close it. Your connection to this place, you might be the key." But even as Thorne spoke, Sarah saw movement at the edges of the vortex. Dark, writhing shapes began to emerge, their forms twisting and changing as they pushed through into our reality. The air was filled with an otherworldly chittering, a sound that seemed to scrape against the very fabric of sanity. "Professor?" Sarah breathed. her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "I don't think we're closing anything. I think we're too late." As if in response to her words, the basement door at the center of the vortex began to creak open. The faint light that had once spilled from beneath it was now a blinding radiance, threatening to consume everything in its path. Sarah felt a pull, an inexorable draw towards the door. The hollow inside her sang with a terrible resonance, and she knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever lay beyond that threshold was calling to her. It had always been calling to her, from the very first moment she had descended those wooden stairs so long ago. "Sarah! No!" Thorne cried, reaching for her as she took a step forward. But his hand passed through her as if she were made of mist. With each step towards the door, Sarah felt herself becoming less substantial, as if she were shedding the constraints of this reality. The chittering of the emerging entities grew louder, more frenzied, but it faded into the background as Sarah focused on the door. As she reached out to touch the weathered wood, Sarah realized that this had always been her destiny. She was the key, not to closing the breach, but to understanding what lay beyond. With a final breath, she pushed the door open and stepped through. The last thing she heard before the light consumed her was Professor Thorne's anguished cry, lost in the rising tide of chaos that now spilled unchecked into our world. The convergence had begun, and Sarah stood at its heart, poised on the threshold between two realities. Whatever came next would reshape not just her life, but the very nature of existence itself. Sarah's world exploded into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shifting geometries. The familiar laws of physics seemed to dissolve around her as she stepped through the basement door and into something else. Reality itself bent and twisted, folding in on itself in ways her mind struggled to comprehend. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah floated in a sea of chaos, her consciousness fragmented and scattered across dimensions she never knew existed. Gradually, painfully, she began to coalesce, to reform into something that at least approximated her former self. When Sarah's vision finally cleared, she found herself in a place that defied description. The landscape, if it could be called that, was a constantly shifting tableau of impossible structures and writhing organic forms. The sky above, or was it below, pulsed with colors that had no names in any human language. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice seemed to twist in the air, becoming a series of discordant tones that reverberated through the alien landscape. She looked down at her hands, only to find that they were no longer solid, but a shimmering outline that constantly shifted and reformed. As she struggled to make sense of her surroundings, Sarah became aware of a presence. It was vast, incomprehensible, a being of such cosmic scale that her mind recoiled from trying to perceive it in its entirety. Yet somehow she knew it was aware of her. "Welcome, Sarah," a voice that was not a voice resonated through her very being. "We have waited so long for you to arrive." Sarah tried to respond, to ask the questions that burned within her fragmented consciousness, but communication in this realm seemed to work differently. Her thoughts, her memories, her very essence were laid bare before the entity. "You seek understanding," the presence continued, "but understanding comes at a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Images flashed through Sarah's mind, her life, her family, the world she had left behind. She saw Professor Thorne, his face contorted in anguish as she stepped through the door. She saw the breach widening, reality itself unraveling as the barriers between worlds crumbled. With a surge of will, Sarah managed to form a coherent thought. "What's happening to my world? Can it be stopped?" A sensation that might have been amusement rippled through the alien landscape. "Your world, Sarah? It was never just your world. The boundaries between realities have always been more permeable than your kind realized. What you perceive as an invasion is merely the natural order reasserting itself." Horror washed over Sarah as the implications became clear. The basement door, the entities that had haunted her dreams, they were not invaders but returning residents. Humanity's perceived dominion over Earth had been nothing more than a temporary illusion. "But the people," Sarah thought desperately, "they're innocent. They don't deserve this." Deserve? The concept seemed to amuse the entity. "The universe does not operate on notions of deserving, Sarah. It simply is. But you are unique, a bridge between worlds. You could play a role in shaping what comes next." Sarah felt a pull, a connection to the world she had left behind. She could sense the chaos spreading, the fabric of reality fraying at the edges. But she also felt a new awareness, a growing understanding of the cosmic forces at play. What do I need to do? Sarah asked, her resolve hardening. Embrace your true nature, the entity replied. Become the conduit between worlds. Guide the convergence. Only then can a new equilibrium be achieved. As the words resonated through her, Sarah felt herself changing, evolving. The hollow feeling that had plagued her for so long was filled with a terrible, awesome power. She was no longer just Sarah, she was becoming something more, something that straddled the line between human and other. With a thought, Sarah opened a portal back to her world. The sight that greeted her was one of beautiful, terrifying chaos. Reality itself seemed to be rewriting itself, blending elements of both worlds into something entirely new. As she prepared to step back through, to face the transformed world and her role in shaping its future, Sarah realized that her journey had only just begun. The basement door that had haunted her for so long was now a gateway to infinite possibilities, and she stood at the threshold of a new era. With a deep breath that wasn't quite a breath, Sarah stepped forward, ready to embrace her destiny as the bridge between worlds. Chapter 16, The Convergence. Sarah stepped through the portal, her newly transformed consciousness struggling to process the scene before her. The world she had known was gone, replaced by a nightmarish fusion of realities. The sky above was a churning maelstrom of impossible colors, punctuated by floating islands of earth and writhing tentacles that seemed to reach down from the heavens. The streets of her once familiar town were now twisted labyrinths of non-Euclidean geometry. Buildings warped and pulsed with an inner life, their windows resembling eyes that followed her every move. In the distance, great crystalline spires erupted from the ground, piercing the sky and seeming to connect the earth to the cosmic chaos above. As Sarah moved through this transformed landscape, she became aware of the other inhabitants. Some were clearly human, cowering in fear or wandering in a daze, their minds unable to comprehend the new reality. Others were something else. Creatures of myth and nightmare walked openly, regarding Sarah with a mix of curiosity and reverence. "What have I done?" Sarah whispered, her words echoing with an otherworldly resonance. The weight of her decision, her role in this convergence, pressed down upon her. A familiar voice cut through the cacophony of this new world. "Sarah!" It was Professor Thorne, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, relief, fear, and something else. Awe. As Sarah turned to face him, she caught her reflection in a nearby warped surface. She barely recognized herself. Her form shimmered and shifted, sometimes appearing human, other times as something more. Her eyes glowed with an inner light, windows to the vast cosmic knowledge she now possessed. "Professor," Sarah said, her voice carrying undertones that seemed to vibrate the very air, I understand now. Everything." Thorne approached cautiously, his scientific curiosity warring with his instinct for self-preservation. "What's happening, Sarah? What is all this?" Sarah's gaze seemed to look through Thorne beyond him to the very fabric of reality itself. "The veils between worlds have fallen. What we thought was our reality was merely a temporary state, a bubble of perceived normalcy in a vast ocean of cosmic chaos. And now the true nature of existence is reasserting itself." Thorne's eyes widened as he processed her words. Is there any way to stop it? To go back?" Sarah shook her head slowly, a sad smile playing on her lips. "There is no going back, Professor. Only forward. But perhaps there is a way to guide this convergence, to find a balance between the world we knew and the infinite realities now colliding with our own." As if in response to her words, the landscape around them shifted subtly. The chaos seemed to calm, if only slightly. The writhing tentacles in the sky retreated, and some of the more extreme architectural distortions began to stabilize. "You have power here," Thorne realized, looking at Sarah with a mixture of fear and hope. Sarah nodded, flexing her newfound abilities. She could feel the currents of reality flowing around her, through her. With a thought, she could reshape the world, but the consequences of each action rippled out in ways her still partially human mind struggled to fully comprehend. "I do," she acknowledged. "But I'm not the only one. There are others, entities from beyond our understanding. They see this convergence as an opportunity, a chance to reclaim what was once theirs." In the distance, Massive shapes began to take form, emerging from the swirling chaos of the sky. Ancient beings, long forgotten by humanity, were awakening, drawn to the weakened barriers between worlds. What can we do? Thorn asked, his voice small in the face of such cosmic events. Sarah's expression hardened with resolve. We fight. Not with weapons, but with will, with understanding. I am the bridge between worlds, Professor, and I will use that position to negotiate a new reality, one where humanity can survive and adapt to this new cosmic order. As Sarah spoke, her form seemed to grow, expanding beyond the confines of physical space. She was becoming something more than human, a cosmic entity in her own right. Yet, at her core, she held on to her humanity, her connection to the world and the people she had known. It won't be easy, she continued, her voice echoing across dimensions. The old gods and the new realities will clash, but I will stand as the mediator, the fulcrum upon which the fate of our world will balance. Thorn, looking both awed and terrified, nodded slowly. What can I do to help? Sarah's multifaceted gaze focused on him, seeing not just the man before her, but all the potential futures branching out from this moment. Gather the others, Professor. Those who can still think, still reason. We'll need every mind, every ounce of human ingenuity and adaptability to face what's coming. As Thorn hurried off to carry out her instructions, Sarah turned her attention to the cosmic forces gathering on the horizon. The true battle for the future of reality was about to begin. And she stood at its center, the human anchor in a sea of eldritch chaos. The basement door that had started it all seemed so insignificant now, a mere portal to a much larger, much more terrifying truth. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She was transformed, empowered, ready to face whatever horrors the universe might unleash. With a thought, she opened her consciousness to the vast, roiling sea of realities beyond, preparing to negotiate the terms of existence itself. The final chapter of humanity's dominion over Earth had ended. The story of their place in a much larger, much stranger cosmos was about to begin. Chapter 17. The Cosmic Negotiation. Sarah stood at the nexus of realities. Her consciousness expanded beyond the limits of human comprehension. Before her, the fabric of existence rippled and churned, a kaleidoscope of possibilities and parallel worlds colliding in a cosmic maelstrom. The entities she had sensed earlier now loomed large in her perception, vast and ancient beyond measure. They were the Old Ones, beings that had slumbered in the spaces between realities since before the dawn of human civilization. Now, awakened by the convergence Sarah had inadvertently triggered, they sought to reclaim dominion over the realms they once ruled. We have awakened. A voice that was not a voice reverberated through Sarah's being. It was a chorus of countless ancient entities, each with its own agenda, its own hunger for dominion. Sarah steeled herself, drawing upon the cosmic knowledge that now flowed through her. I stand as the bridge between worlds, she proclaimed, her words rippling across dimensions. I seek balance, a new order that respects both your ancient claims and humanity's right to exist. A cacophony of responses crashed over her, a tidal wave of alien thoughts and incomprehensible desires. Some of the Old Ones scoffed at the idea of negotiation, viewing humanity as nothing more than insects to be crushed underfoot. Others, intrigued by Sarah's transformation and the potential she represented, were willing to listen. You presume much, child of dust, one entity hissed, its form a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes. Why should we, who ruled when your kind were but primordial ooze, bend to your will? Sarah stood her ground, her resolve unwavering. Because the world has changed, she countered. Humanity has shaped this reality, imbued it with their dreams and nightmares. To destroy them would be to diminish the very realm you seek to reclaim. As she spoke, Sarah wove the threads of reality around her, creating a tapestry that showcased the beauty and complexity of human civilization. She showed the Old Ones the art, the music, the stories that humans had created, each a reflection of the cosmic truths these ancient beings embodied. See how they dream of you, Sarah said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of universes. In their myths, their legends, even in their fears, they have kept your essence alive, even if they did not know it. Some of the Old Ones stirred, intrigued by this perspective. Others remained unmoved, their hunger for dominion unabated. The negotiations stretched on, time losing all meaning in this liminal space between realities. Sarah proposed a new cosmic order, one where the old ones could reclaim portions of reality, existing alongside but separate from the human world. She offered to serve as a conduit, a high priestess who could facilitate communication and maintain the delicate balance between worlds. And what of those among us who refuse this? Compromise. A particularly malevolent entity growled, its very presence causing reality to warp and twist. Sarah's eyes flashed with power, her form briefly expanding to match the cosmic scale of the old ones. "Then you will face me," she declared, her voice resonating with newfound authority. "I may be young by your reckoning, but I am the fulcrum upon which this new reality balances. I will not allow the wholesale destruction of humanity." A tense silence followed, the fate of countless realities hanging in the balance. Then, slowly, agreements began to form. Some old ones, seeing the wisdom in Sarah's proposal, pledged to honor the new boundaries. Others, while not fully convinced, agreed to a period of observation before making their final decision. As the cosmic negotiation drew to a close, Sarah felt the weight of her responsibility settle upon her. She had averted total annihilation, but the path ahead was fraught with peril. Maintaining this delicate balance would be the work of lifetimes. With a thought, Sarah began to weave the new reality into existence. The human world would remain largely as it was, but with hidden pockets where the old ones could dwell and exert their influence. The barriers between worlds would be permeable, allowing for limited interaction while preventing full-scale invasion. As she worked, Sarah glimpsed the future she was creating. She saw cultists and scholars seeking communion with the old ones, gaining forbidden knowledge at great cost. She saw heroes rising to face eldritch horrors that slipped through the cracks, and she saw herself, forever changed, standing guard at the threshold between worlds. The basement door that had started it all now seemed like a distant memory, a small portal that had opened the way to a vast, terrifying, and wondrous new reality. As Sarah put the finishing touches on her cosmic weave, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The world would never be the same. The age of blissful ignorance was over. But humanity had been given a chance, an opportunity to find its place in a universe far stranger and more magnificent than they had ever imagined. With a final surge of will, Sarah sealed the new cosmic pact. The convergence stabilized, reality settling into its new configuration. As she prepared to return to the earthly plane to begin her work as the mediator between worlds, Sarah took a deep breath. The true adventure, she realized, was only just beginning. Chapter Echoes of a New Reality. The Return. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, the familiar sight of the basement ceiling coming into focus. For a moment she lay there, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the cosmic vastness she had just experienced and the mundane reality of the musty basement. Slowly she sat up, her body feeling both weightless and impossibly heavy. The basement looked the same, yet utterly different. Shadows danced at the corners of her vision, hinting at realities beyond human perception. The air itself seemed charged with potential, crackling with unseen energies. "I'm back," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made her shiver. She looked down at her hands, half expecting them to be translucent or glowing with eldritch power. They appeared normal, and yet Sarah closed her eyes, reaching out with her newfound senses. The cosmic pact she had forged thrummed through the fabric of reality, a constant reminder of the delicate balance she now maintained. She could feel the presence of the old ones lurking just beyond the veil of human perception, their ancient power held in check by the boundaries she had established. With a deep breath, Sarah stood up, her legs slightly unsteady. The basement door that had started it all still stood ajar, but now it seemed almost comically mundane. She approached it slowly, her hand hovering over the worn wood. "Just a door," like she murmured, a sad smile playing on her lips. And yet, so much more. As her fingers brushed the surface, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. This door, this simple wooden construct, had become a symbol of the threshold between worlds. In a way, every door now held the potential to be a gateway to realms beyond. Sarah turned away from the door, her gaze sweeping across the basement. The claw marks and smears of dirt that had once seemed so ominous now appeared almost childish. She knew the true horrors that lurked beyond human understanding, and they were far more terrifying, and beautiful than anything that could leave physical marks. The new normal. Climbing the stairs, Sarah emerged onto the main floor of the house. Everything looked exactly as she had left it, and yet the world had fundamentally changed. She could see faint shimmers in the air, glimpses of realities overlapping with her own. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Sarah stepped onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. To any passerby, she would appear normal, a young woman watching the sunset, but Sarah knew she would never be normal again. As darkness fell, Sarah's heightened senses detected stirrings in the shadows. Creatures of the night, some mundane, others far more exotic, began to emerge. She could feel the pull of the old ones, their whispers carried on the wind, tempting her with promises of power and knowledge. But Sarah stood firm, her will unshakable. She was the guardian now, the mediator between worlds. The weight of this responsibility settled on her shoulders like a cosmic mantle. "And so it begins," she whispered to the night. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah began to adapt to her new role. She learned to navigate the delicate web of realities, intervening when necessary to maintain the balance. Sometimes this meant thwarting the schemes of overzealous cultists. Other times, it required her to negotiate with entities beyond human comprehension. She watched as the world around her slowly began to change. Most humans remained blissfully unaware of the cosmic shift, but some, the sensitive ones, the dreamers, the outsiders, began to sense that something was different. Strange cults sprang up overnight, while ancient orders long thought extinct suddenly resurged with new vigor. Sarah found allies in unexpected places: a librarian with a collection of forbidden texts, a detective with a knack for solving impossible cases, and a street artist whose murals seemed to ripple with otherworldly energy. Together, they formed a loose network of guardians, working to protect humanity from the worst excesses of cosmic interference, while also preparing them for the day when the veil would inevitably thin further. The endless vigil. As months turned into years, Sarah's power and understanding grew. She learned to walk between worlds, to communicate with entities that defied human categorization, and to manipulate reality itself in small but significant ways. But with each new ability came new challenges and threats to the delicate balance she had established. There were times when Sarah longed for the simplicity of her old life, for the days when her biggest worry was what lay behind a creepy basement door. But those moments of nostalgia were fleeting. She knew that she had been chosen, or perhaps had chosen herself, for this role, and there was no turning back. On the anniversary of her transformation, Sarah returned to the old house, to the basement where it had all begun. She stood before the door, her hand resting on the worn wood. With a soft smile, she turned the knob and pulled it open. Beyond the threshold lay not a musty storage space, but a swirling vortex of cosmic energy. It was a gateway to the realms beyond, a direct line to the old ones and the unfathomable realities they inhabited. Sarah stepped through without hesitation, ready to face whatever challenges awaited her on the other side. The door swung shut behind her, once again appearing as nothing more than an ordinary basement door. But now, anyone who looked closely might notice strange symbols etched into the wood, pulsing faintly with an otherworldly light. And in the dead of night, when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest, those with the right kind of ears might hear whispers emanating from behind that unassuming door, echoes of cosmic truths and eldritch horrors, kept at bay by the tireless efforts of an unexpected guardian. The story of the basement door was over, but for Sarah, and for the world she now protected, the true saga had only just begun. Epilogue: Echoes of the Infinite, the Watcher at the Threshold. Years have passed since Sarah first descended those creaking wooden stairs and faced the horrors lurking behind the basement door. The old house stands silent now, its windows dark, its paint peeling. To the casual observer, it appears abandoned, forgotten by time and the world that moves ceaselessly around it. But appearances can be deceiving. On a moonless night, when the veil between worlds grows thin, a figure approaches the house. Cloaked in shadows, it moves with an otherworldly grace, feet barely touching the overgrown path. The door opens without a sound, welcoming the visitor home. Inside, Sarah stands at the top of the basement stairs, her eyes gleaming with an inner light that speaks of cosmic knowledge and terrible burdens. She has changed in the intervening years. Her once youthful face now bears the subtle marks of one who has gazed into the abyss and emerged transformed. With measured steps, Sarah descends into the basement. The door at the bottom no longer holds any terror for her. Instead, it represents a boundary, a threshold between realities that she has sworn to protect. She places her hand on the worn wood, feeling the pulse of cosmic energies flowing through it. The claw marks and smears of dirt that once seemed so ominous are now barely visible, obscured by intricate, ever-shifting patterns that glow with an inner light. Another cycle begins, Sarah murmurs, her voice carrying echoes of distant stars and ancient wisdom. The eternal vigil. Sarah pushes the door open, revealing not a musty storage space, but a swirling vortex of cosmic energy. Colors that have no name in human language dance and twist, forming shapes that defy Euclidean geometry. To gaze upon it for too long would drive an ordinary person mad, but Sarah's eyes remain clear and focused. She steps through the portal, her form shimmering and distorting as she passes from one realm to another. In this space between spaces, Sarah assumes her true role: the watcher, the guardian, the one who stands between humanity and the vast, uncaring cosmos. Here, she communes with entities beyond human comprehension, negotiating truces and enforcing ancient pacts. She witnesses the birth and death of universes, the rise and fall of civilizations that exist outside of time as we understand it. And always, always, she remembers her purpose: to protect, to preserve, and to maintain the delicate balance that allows humanity to exist in blissful ignorance of the terrors that lurk just beyond the veil of reality. The price of knowledge. Hours or eons later, time has little meaning in this place. Sarah returns through the portal. She emerges into the basement, closing the door behind her with a soft click. For a moment, she leans against it, her shoulders sagging with the weight of cosmic responsibility. But then she straightens, her resolve hardening once more. Sarah climbs the stairs, each step bringing her closer to the world of mundane concerns and everyday worries. As she reaches the top, she pauses, looking back at the basement door one last time. "Until the next cycle," she whispers, a sad smile playing on her lips. Sarah exits the house, locking the door behind her. To anyone watching, she would appear to be nothing more than a woman leaving an old, abandoned property. They would never guess at the eldritch horrors she has faced, the cosmic truths she has uncovered, or the sacrifices she has made to keep the world turning, blissfully unaware of what lurks in the shadows. As she walks away, Sarah's thoughts turn to the future. She knows that one day, perhaps soon, perhaps in 1,000 years, another curious soul will descend those basement stairs. They will face the terror behind the door, just as she did. And when that day comes, Sarah will be there to guide them, to show them the truths that lie beyond human perception. For now, though, she melts into the night, a silent guardian walking between worlds, forever changed by what she found behind that simple basement door. The story of the basement door is over, but the vigil is eternal.